everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Lee Singletary, co-lead of the Out at Comcast Employee Resource Group at Comcast headquarters. I'm very excited to be joined by Maneesh Goyal, a self-described serial entrepreneur and founding partner of Sona, a hot new restaurant in New York City. Maneesh, thanks so much for being here.
I'm really excited, Lee. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Now, you're a very accomplished business owner. You got your start as an event planner, right, for Sean Diddy Combs. Tell us about that period in your career and how you went from planning parties to now starting your own ventures.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and really, it's a journey that I think can best be described by my relationship with risk. I'm somebody who, I think, just growing up as the son of immigrants in Dallas, Texas, recognizing I was a little bit different. I certainly didn't come out when I was in Texas. It took me many, many years after that, but I always knew that I was going to have to kind of chart my own course. And because of the way that my life in some ways made me do that, as it came to my professional life, I was a little bit, I was driven by fulfillment. And I said, how do I find fulfillment? And while I went to grad school and in public health, and I had a early career in nonprofits, I was always kind of enticed and enchanted by the idea of bringing people together and creating events. And so very early on, it was actually in 2001, I got an opportunity to work for Sean Combs, for Puff Daddy. And it was just kind of a dream because, here I was, this young, new to New York, gay Indian kid, and I was suddenly, thrust into this world. And it really helped me to recognize that, I was not necessarily so focused on the idea of working for celebrities, but I was definitely focused on the idea that I want to be in the rooms where events are being made and experiences are being created. And so that led me on a long journey to ultimately starting my own firm. And I called it MKG because it looked like the word marketing, but it's actually my initials. So that was helpful because I was doing event marketing for brands. And I grew it, and it was amazing. For over a decade, I just put my head down and I grew it to 150 employees and offices in New York and LA and ancillary businesses. And it was just, I had a fun time being an entrepreneur, being a dream maker, and just really working with clients to understand how they can reach consumers through experience and through events. And so bringing people together has always been in my core. But then to get to the restaurant, there's something about not just wanting to have fun with your job, but it's also wanting to lead with your heart. And as a young kid in Texas, my father, as an immigrant with 3 young kids, I'm the youngest of 3, he looked around, and this was in 1975, he looked around and he realized there was not a single Indian restaurant, not just in the city of Dallas, but in the whole state of Texas. So he opened the first Indian restaurant in the state of Texas. It was called India House in 1975, the year I was born. And he had it for about a decade. And I just found my identity in that restaurant. I loved it. And so when I say I led with my heart, I said, as a young kid, I said, at one point, I want to do what Dad did. I want to have an Indian restaurant. And so after I kind of pivoted out of the event marketing world, I said, okay, now's the time. And I've never done this. So, going back to my connection to risk, I've never done a restaurant. I've never been in hospitality, especially in New York City, especially, coming out of a pandemic. But here we go. Let's do this. And I opened Sona in March of this year.
That's amazing. And it sounds like you've had such a storied career, right? You're starting in the healthcare industry, pivoting into events, and now hospitality. Though you say you didn't have a ton of experience in it, it's almost like it was in your blood. Hospitality and events are not too dissimilar.
That's right. It's kind of in my blood, and also it was in, like I was saying, it was in my heart. I said, I kind of said, well, if my dad could figure this out, and he had never done this before, and he was young and an immigrant and introducing a whole new cuisine to the entire state of Texas, I said, if he can do this, I can do this. So you just kind of figure it out along the way.
That's awesome. So from a highly sought after, I imagine, creative agency to other business ventures along the way, you opened Sona with actor Priyanka Chopra Jonas, whom many probably know. What was the process like for you? And what advice maybe do you have for business owners who maybe have a tough time right now in particular?
Yeah, for sure. Listen, these are very trying times, but they're also times that are ripe with opportunity. And so I would say that the process was really that as I looked around the landscape, and of course I had this in my heart and my blood, but I also had to see, well, where do I fit in? And where does this restaurant fit in? And as I looked around the landscape, I was kind of struck by the idea that while, even Mexican food, I would say 25 years ago, it didn't get the cred that it now gets in terms of being a real destination. It might have been just kind of roadside places or fast food places, but now Mexican food has been elevated, and you really consider it to be as wonderful a cuisine as it really is, but also as other cuisines, oftentimes that come from Europe. But and Asian food more broadly has started to that's happened, especially I would say in the last 10 years. Korean barbecue has really kind of gotten put on the map, and certainly Chinese food has, and Japanese food. When I was growing up, nobody ate sushi, but now sushi is very commonly, it's almost a staple. But Indian food, interestingly, has always been in some ways relegated to either a $7.99 lunch buffet where you might kind of wonder about, it's might be delicious, but you might not wonder about how healthy it is or how hygienic it could even be. There's been some real challenges for the industry in terms of perception, or there might be some very corporate kind of what I call midtown places, that serves a business customer. But where do you find like the Mamafuku of Indian food, like a cool hip place? Or where do you find like almost to do to Indian food what Nobu did to Japanese food, and just make it a vibe and make it cool and make it aspirational? And that interestingly had not been done. So I said, well, that's the place I can enter. And then I happened, because at the time my husband was working for Delta Airlines, so he was in Atlanta. So I was by myself all week, and Priyanka Chopra Jonas, I know her manager. Her manager is a great friend of mine, and Priyanka at the time was living in New York filming her show, Quantico. And so we were both kind of like lonely in New York. And so we just became friends through her manager, who kind of set us up on a friend date, and we became fast friends. And then it was at that time I started to think about this project, and I said, hey, well, Priyanka, you are really the world's first global Indian. I said, why don't you join me? So that's how she got involved. And now, we are a formidable team with my other partner, David Rabin. So together, it's really just kind of become this force. I said, if you're building a business, and, going back to your other point about where do you go, or like expecting these times, I said, if you're building your business, you got to know what you can't do. And then, you got to fill the holes. And so I had the vision, I had the idea, I had the passion, I had the story, but I needed legitimacy. And David is my other partner, David Rabin. He's been in the restaurant business for a decade. So he gives me legitimacy. And then I said, okay, well, now we're just two guys with an idea. I said, now we need a megaphone. And so, because I don't have a megaphone. And so that's where Priyanka comes in, and Priyanka became the megaphone. So, it's about filling the holes in terms of what you don't have. And that's what I was able to do. And now during these times, thankfully, we're seeing that there's a lot of pent up energy as we kind of come on the other side of this. And we are thankfully, kind of being able to be a repository for people who want to be out.
Yeah, I know for myself, I'm so eager to get back to restaurants, fine dining experiences in New York. We miss that.
Totally.
And you spoke to the power of having a dynamic A-list team, and the importance of relationships, and having the right people in your corner. I hear, Priyanka is in a creative capacity. Tell us about the interiors and the vibe of the restaurant. I know it's been open for a little bit of time now, but what can people expect when they're ready to get back out there?
Yeah, well, first of all, Lee, I can't wait to have you come. You need to come into Sona soon. And everybody who's watching, when you're in New York, please come to Sona. And what you can expect, honestly, is an Indian restaurant that almost it's like something you haven't ever seen before, because we went very evocative. We're not on the nose India, but what a lot of people don't recognize is that the second highest concentration of Art Deco outside of South Beach in Miami, which is the highest concentration of Art Deco, is in Mumbai, is in Bombay, India. So Bombay has this rich history with Deco. So we really went for this amazingly Deco vibe and spirit to our restaurant. if you look at we have these beautiful lamps on every table, and the way that we use beautiful materials and fabrics that come from India, instead of being overt, we cut up beautiful vintage saris and we turn them into the lampshades. And so, so it's very evocative and it's spirited and without being so kind of affronting or in your face. So you're gonna feel a great vibe. You are gonna feel a vibe that is welcoming, that is open to all, that is a space where you can sit back and have a really great New York night.
Love it. I'm excited to check it out.
Yeah.
Now, restaurants too, they employ quite a lot of employees, and so that's what I think is what's so remarkable about opening a restaurant, not only in this time, but people are having a lot of challenges amid the pandemic, and obviously we're starting to rebound. But how do you keep your employees motivated? Either in some of your newer ventures or with MKG?
So it's such a great question, because ultimately none of us live on an island, and we are only as good as the people around us, and we need to be motivated by leaders, and we need to support those that we're trying to lift up and collaborate with. So I think a lot about the question that you just asked, Lee. I think a lot about like motivation for showing up. And so now, as a leader myself and as a leader at MKG, I had to provide that motivation to show up, because you want people to fully show up. And so there's a few things that I do. I think core values actually really do make a difference, to state them out loud, to be them. And one of the core values that I've always espoused is the idea that, we said this out loud at MKG, which was be your funky self. So be your funky self. So like, don't hide who you are, what you are, but we want to allow for you to be yourself, because if you are yourself, then we have all of you when you show up. And when you show up to work and you show up to collaborate, to brainstorm, to engage with clients or with internal partners. So be your funky self. And if you just say that, and it just allows people to settle and to not have to worry about the masking that a lot of people have to do. And the whole notion of imposter syndrome, you can kind of, nip it in the bud. So be your funky self. The other thing that I think is just critical is the art of communication. And what I mean specifically is you have to have, to make a team work, you have to recognize that communication is your biggest asset. And if people feel like they know what's happening, they will work harder for you and want to show up. If they feel like they're in the dark and I have no idea what's going around here, or like no one tells me, or if you start to hear that, things like, oh, news to me, like it'll just start to spread like wildfire. And so, or you can go the other routes where you just kind of have this connection to communication and this almost adherence to communication, where people just feel like, I know what's happening. I know what's in the mix. So it takes a lot of time. It means emails that you send out. It means, constantly kind of having your door open, but that communication is critical. And the third thing that I think is really important is access to leadership. People want to know who they work for or who they are working in support of. And so while, it doesn't mean you have to do one-on-ones with every single team member, because that just might not be efficient, it does mean that you need to show up in their space, however you can. And so that access to leadership, people will then say, wow, well, he's different than other bosses, or like he inspires me, or she really gets me going. And that means a lot. So you have to think about what's the access you're giving people. If you're just behind closed doors all the time and they have no idea, they never see you, it's going to be hard to keep people motivated. So, those three things are three things that I really espouse myself in every organization that I build, and I've seen the power of them.
I love your perspective on that. Those three things are just so true, especially as, Gen Z enters the workforce, and right. There's a greater focus on just wanting, more exposure, more connectivity, better communication, as you mentioned. Gen Z, I read a stat that said 1 in 5 identify as LGBTQ. And so I want to pivot now a little bit. How has being an out and proud member of the LGBTQ community shaped your approach to leadership?
It's so again, great question, Lee, because it's almost, I don't know that I would be the leader that I am if I hadn't had the experience of being a member of this community, because I was shaped early on and early on, I dealt with otherness, and I dealt with exclusion, and I dealt with self-doubt in a way that, you know, I would look at people even in college who had confidence, and it was so hard for me to understand where did they get that? And it was because they were living very differently in their skin than I was living. And so their confidence, which was so foreign to me, but was sought by me, was something that ultimately, I think me embracing my gayness and my queerness only became intrinsic to me once I became who I am and allowed myself to be who I am. So I could only be a leader once I was out, because the otherness was not working for me, you know, and in fact, it brought me to very dark places. And so while I still feel chills, even with someone like you, when you say, wow, you live an out and proud life, because for me, it's still chilling to think that, wow, I really do, because I didn't for a long time. So, you know, I was very deeply closeted for a long time, and I had a lot of angst about how I could actually reconcile my cultural background, being an Indian guy in a culture that, you know, didn't have a lot of exposure, especially at those times when I was dealing with my sexuality. How could I live in this world? And because, you know, in some ways I didn't know that there was space for me. And it's something that I think has helped me now to think about bringing your funky self and communicating and giving people access to leadership, because I've certainly seen the other side of not having that. And so it's why I want to be inspiring where I can be, because I was looking for inspiration. It's why I want people to bring their funky self, because I was debilitated by my funky self, you know? And so I think that, you know, this is all coming from a very lived way for me now to be in some ways the counterpoint to what I had experienced. And in some ways, you know, people brought it on myself, but I brought it upon myself as well, because I just, you know, I had a hard time figuring out where I could fit in.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much for sharing your personal story with respect to coming out. Everybody does it in their own way. I myself have not been as authentic as I could have been, and it's an evolution for everyone. And so I almost wonder, you know, what is your advice for the LGBTQ employee, and what is your advice to their employers?
That's so insightful. You know, it's so funny, but just before I answer that, you know, when you just said, you know, you're coming out and we all deal with authenticity and how authentic are we living? It's so funny. And I was just thinking the other day that if you've heard one coming out story, you've heard one coming out story, meaning that like they are all so different. All of our stories are so unique and different and specific to who we are, because there is no formula for coming out. There's no template. You know, sure, there might be some through lines, but all of ours are so unique. And so I think, you know, as an employee, I really think that where you can, you need to find allies. You need to find people that are in your corner and people that will understand you and allow for you to kind of slowly settle in, because it might not be your boss immediately, or it might not be leadership, because that might be too far or too jarring and too stressful, frankly. But find your people, find your tribe. And I think that really matters. And it could be through the out ERG, or it could just be through people in your, you know, on the teams that you work, or it could be virtually people in other offices that you could connect with. Whatever it might be and however it might be, you need to find your people, because once you find your people, you will start to suddenly feel like, okay, I can do more, because I now have a foundation and I have some rocks behind my, you know, underneath my feet, and that helps. And as an employer, I think it's critical that you are creating an environment of inclusivity and creating an environment of open dialogue. And so if people raise a point about a way that they feel, you cannot dismiss it. You have to listen. And, you know, and listen, I'm learning this myself, because in a very different way, we just got reviewed by the New York Times. And, you know, advice I got was, do not dismiss their criticisms as like, oh, you just don't get it. You have to acknowledge the fact that people, like, he might have some criticisms of your restaurant, this reviewer, and you need to listen and embrace it. In the same way, when people are on your team, or, if you are an employer, you have to really listen, because if they're bringing something to you, there's something there. And so I think this notion of dismissing and saying like, oh, that's just one person's experience. If that's one person's experience, that's one person's experience, and that matters. And so I think and the team is never going to form if one person is not feeling the support that they need. So that's a little bit of what I try to do, and I certainly don't sugarcoat to say all these things are easy, but it's the work that needs to be done to build the most productive teams.
For sure. And I think also it goes back to, in tandem, what you said at the beginning, which is you'll find success when you sort of lead with your heart. I think there's a lot to that in its sort of simplest form.
I think that's right. And the thing that I would say is that you'll be, as an employer specifically, if you make space for your LGBT employees to really shine and not giving any extra credit, but really making space for, what other communities have just been kind of walked into a room and had their shoulders back and stood tall, while a lot of us have shrunk and stuck to the wall. So if you make space for everyone to stand tall, you'll be amazed at what can be accomplished. And so you stand to benefit, the employer stands to benefit, but you have to do the work to get the benefit. And so that's really, what I believe, that, wow, we can really accomplish, but we need to set the stage.
Wise words. Maneesh, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your wisdom with us today. And please tell those watching how they can keep up with you.
Yeah, for sure. So I am super happy to have had this conversation, Lee, first of all. So thank you. And thank you, everyone who is watching. And please do stay in touch. I am on Instagram at Maneesh K. Goyal, Maneeshk, like the word kite, Goyal, Goyal. And please come to Sona. Sona is the name of the restaurant. We are on Instagram at Sona, New York. And just email us at reservations@sona-nyc.com. And let them know that you watch this, and I'll make sure you get well taken care of.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Maneesh. On behalf of Out at Comcast, APA ERG, I'm Lee Singletary. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.